the Trump presidency was an early issue on that stage tonight.
We have a criminal living in the White House. Ambassador Sondland, by his own words, told us that everyone was in the loop. That means it is a criminal enterprise engaged in by the president, from what we heard today, the vice president, the secretary of state, and the chief of staff.
I learned something about these impeachment trials. I learned, number one, that Donald Trump doesn't want me to be the nominee. Secondly, I found out that Vladimir Putin doesn't want me to be president.
Sadly, we have a president who is not only a pathological liar, he is likely the most corrupt president in the modern history of America.
Read the Mueller report, all 442 pages of it that showed how the president tried to obstruct justice. And when Congress failed to act at that moment, it meant the president felt free to break the law again and again and again. And that's what's happened with Ukraine.
I have made it very clear that this is impeachable conduct, and I've called for an impeachment proceeding. I just believe our job as jurors is to look at each count and make a decision.
The constitutional process of impeachment should be beyond politics, and it is not a part of the campaign, but the president's conduct is.
We also heard from Joe Biden about how he might deal with a possible criminal investigation into President Trump.
Would you support a potential criminal investigation into President Trump after he leaves office, even if you thought it might further inflame the country's divisions?
Look, I would not direct my Justice Department like this president does. I'd let them make their independent judgment. I would not dictate who should be prosecuted or who should be exonerated. That's not the role of the President of the United States. It's the Attorney General of the United States, not the President's attorney, private attorney. Let them make an independent judgment. If that was the judgment that he violated the law and he should be, in fact, criminally prosecuted, then so be it. But I would not direct it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.